Welcome. Thank you for joining today's paper. Sorry, it's my dog. On the relationship between Israel and Latin America and the Caribbean. My name is Denise Yanovich, and I am the Managing Director of the Georgetown Americas Institute. The Georgetown Americas Institute, established in 2020, is a platform for dialogue, research, and impact around the key challenges facing Latin America and the hemisphere. It comes at a moment where our hemisphere is at a crossroads. The region has made great strides since the years of unrest of the 1980s. Notable economic and social progress has been achieved through a commitment to integration and democracy. The region remains the most democratic in the developing world, and its democracies have shown resilience and vitality despite challenging circumstances. Recently, however, there is growing evidence of democratic backsliding and economic instability and inequality in the Americas. This will require greater engagement from interested parties to positively impact and devise solutions to the most pressing issues. As the Georgetown Americas Institute, we hope to bring issues from the region to the forefront of the conversation, both at Georgetown and Washington, D.C. As part of our work in 2022, we launched Spotlight on the Americas, an event series featuring conversations with experts on diverse themes related to the Western Hemisphere. Today, we are delighted to welcome Dr. Grace Wermenbol and Professor Arie Kacowicz to have a conversation on the history and recent evolution of relationships between Israel and Latin America and the Caribbean. Dr. Wermenbol is the Middle East Director at the U.S. Office of the Director of National Intelligence and is a non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute in Washington. Professor Kacowicz is the Arie and Cecile Goldman Visiting Professor in the Department of Government at Georgetown University and a Professor of International Relations at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Both Dr. Wermenbol and Professor Kacowicz have impressive credentials, and I encourage you to read their full bios on our website. I will not go through all their accomplishments now, as I'm sure participants are eager for the discussion to start. Our event will start with a presentation by Professor Kacowicz, who will go into the history of the relationship between Israel and the region, followed by a presentation by Dr. Wermenbol on the evolution of relationships during the past decade and their geopolitical context. After the presentation, I will follow up with some questions and then open it up for a Q&A with the audience. Please use the Q&A feature to submit your questions. Finally, this event will be held in English with simultaneous translation into Spanish. To access the translation, please click on the translation button located at the bottom of your screen. Este evento se llevará a cabo en inglés. Pueden acceder a la traducción en español a través del botón de traducción que se encuentra en la parte baja de sus pantallas. Without further ado, I am pleased to turn it over to Professor Kacowicz. The floor is yours.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Hope you can hear me. So let me try in the next few minutes to introduce you to a kind of historical review of the relations between Israel and the Latin American countries. So I want to suggest several points going chronologically and then maybe trying to summarize some of the points that I may suggest to try to make sense, because those are relations that have been going on for a long time. Just to give you an idea, Israel was created on May 1948, so we are talking about 75 years or so, and I'll try to do that just in a few minutes. The first point I want to raise is the fact that if we consider Latin America one of the most significant regions in the global south, what we used to call the third world, I think that no other region in the global south has sustained a continuous and relatively benign relationship with Israel in the past 70, 75 years, like Latin America. So from all the 34 countries that we have in Latin America and the Caribbean, I would say that only a few do not have diplomatic relations with Israel. Nicaragua didn't have that until 2009 for a period, Guyana before 92, Cuba after the October War of 1973, Bolivia between 2009 and 2019, and Venezuela. But the vast majority of Latin American countries have good relations, stable relations with Israel since its inception. And this is very different compared to other regions of the global south. The second point I want to raise very quickly, and I think it was mentioned in the advertising for this conversation, and this is something that I like to remind my Israeli students when I teach them about Latin America, is the fact that the Latin American countries have been protagonists and essential in the partition plan of November 1947 at the United Nations that, in a sense, created the possibility for a two-state solution and the creation of the State of Israel. 13 out of 20 Latin American countries vote in favor of that resolution out of 34 countries that were at the UN at that time. And there were particular Latin American countries like Guatemala through Granados, Uruguay through Fabregat, and Brazil through the president of the UN Assembly, Osvaldo Aranha, that fulfill a crucial role. And this is very, very important to understand the past, but also to understand the present. Because we might come full circle when in the last few years we have seen Brazil pushing for the recognition of a Palestinian state. From the Latin American side, this is no zero sum, just completing the circle. As we move very fast, since I know that I'm very limited in time, once Israel was created into the 50s and the 60s, Israel was considered a pioneer in terms of agriculture and a new country that came out of the colonization. So this was a model, and in a sense, Israel had a lot of soft power at that time. And I also want to mention a fact that people are not aware that before 67 or into the 70s, there were 10 embassies in Western Jerusalem that belonged to Latin America. The Six-Day War of 1967, that was a turning point. At the beginning, the Latin American countries supported Israel's right of self-defense. But as we move into the 1970s, we start seeing a change in their position. These Latin American countries, they identify with the non-aligned movement, and this will culminate in 1975 with the resolution at the UN that equates Zionism with racism, that was supported by Mexico and Brazil. Then they withdrew from that. In this period, as I mentioned, in the 60s and 70s, the relations were all the time quite good. One exception that was quite extraordinary had to do with the kidnapping or capture of Adolf Eichmann in Argentina in May 1960 that led to a temporary rupture of the relations between Argentina and Israel. After the 70s, Latin America becomes a chief export market for Israel's arms industry. Israel kept relations with the Argentina, with military regimes like the Argentina junta, 1983, and Israel was also involved as a kind of proxy for the United States in the Central American civil wars in the 80s. That did not necessarily add to Israel's popularity. And I would say that since 67 and into the present, the Arab-Israeli conflict and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict also reverberated and reflected in relations between Israel and Latin America. Just an example, when Israel passed in 1980 the law declaring Jerusalem as its capital, most of the Latin American countries would leave Jerusalem and move their embassies to Tel Aviv. The involvement in Lebanon in the 80s and 90s would lead, and this has repercussions for the relations between Israel and Latin America, to two very heinous terrorist attacks perpetrated against the Israeli embassy in Argentina in 1992, and the Jewish center in Buenos Aires, AMIA, in July 1994, perpetrated by Iran and Hezbollah, and that carried that into the present. As we move into the 90s, we have seen a deepening in the relations between Israel and several Latin American countries, the major Latin American countries, due to economic relations, security relations. And another point that I want to bring is also the fact that there has been quite significant Jewish community, diaspora in some of the Latin American countries. Then their numbers have dwindled over time. Today, I would say there might be about 200 Jews in Argentina, 100,000 in Brazil, 50,000 in Mexico, but that's also relevant. And just to conclude this very, very brief review, to bring my colleague Grace that might refer essentially to the last decade, I would say that the relations between Israel and Latin America over time have to be considered and assessed against several general points. One has to do with the distribution of power in the international system and the relations between Israel and the United States. The United States is always there, and now we have a new emerging superpower, and that's China. That might change part of the picture. A second point I would make has to do with Latin American politics and the pendular relations between left and right, from a pink tide to a left, less pink tide and back, and that might affect the relations, have affected the relations between Latin America. And the third point that I would refer to has to do again with the Arab-Israeli conflict. So you can see that at periods when there were prospects for a peace process, like the 90s with the Oslo process, so you see a better atmosphere for the relations between Israel and Latin America. And if we compare that with the current times with the government that we have in Israel, so that might also have an impact, this time maybe a negative impact upon those relations. I think that I have not exhausted my 12 minutes.
I think you did a great job. Thank you. And you still have some minutes left, but I'll take it, turn it over to you, Grace.
All right. Thank you, Arie. I'd like to thank Denise Yanovich and the Georgetown Americas Institute for inviting me to participate in today's event. Despite being important to understanding Israeli foreign policy objectives, Israeli Latin American relations have not received a lot of focus to date. So I'm very grateful to the Institute for highlighting this topic and inviting me to speak in today's discussion. So I'll start with a few disclaimers. First, I am here today in private capacity, so I'm not, my comments do not reflect U.S. foreign policy objectives or views. And the second disclaimer is that I do not speak Spanish or Portuguese, so I do apologize in advance if any of my pronunciations are less than adequate. And with that, I'll start with my opening remarks for today. And I'll briefly kind of go back to the previous decades and follow up on some things that were mentioned by Arie in his opening remarks. And the reason that I wanted to kind of go back to focus on previous decade is that I think it provides some important contextualization for the trends and currents that we have witnessed in recent years, and which I will discuss in just a moment. So Latin America and Israel have, as you just heard, enjoyed a long-standing relationship. And in fact, Latin America played a particularly crucial role in the establishment of the Israeli state, which at the time reflected both the influence the US was able to project to the South and also existing pro-Zionist attitudes and sympathies. So in the partition vote that was held in November 1947 by the UN General Assembly, major contributions were made by Latin America, and it was the 13 affirmative Latin American votes out of a total of 33 that made the successful vote on partition possible. And particularly formative roles were played by representatives from countries such as Guatemala and Uruguay. And following the establishment, or the unilateral establishment, of Israel in May 1948, Latin American countries were also some of the first to recognize Israel, with Nicaragua coming just third after the US and Russia on May 18th, 1948, and followed closely by Uruguay and Guatemala in that same month. So in policy and media writings, there has been a bit of a tendency, I believe, to pinpoint the so-called pink tide, or the political move to the left, in the post-Cold War era and a resulting identification with the Palestinian cause as a key juncture for Israeli-Latin American relations. And while I think there's certainly some truth to this, it is worth noting that the Palestinian dimension was not wholly absent from relations in the decades following the establishment of Israel. And this was both true among more democratic and right-wing regimes. So particularly after the 1967 and 73 war, in light of oil demands, increased Arab engagement, and consternation over Israeli treatment of the Palestinians, Latin American countries used international fora to express their criticism of Israeli violations of human rights, or to abstain from critical resolutions on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is also something Arie mentioned in his remarks. So both Mexico and Argentina, for instance, moved from abstaining from Israel critical votes in 1972 to voting in favor of resolutions focused on condemning Israeli violations of human rights. With that being said, the support for these resolutions did not necessarily always impact other areas of bilateral relations. Chile, for instance, following the 1975 coup, voted in favor of granting the PLO observer status, even if it did continue to look to Israel to supply anti-tank weapons and other Israeli defense expertise that kept the Pinochet regime in power. So over the course of the past decade, I think Israel has really sought to balance a desire for enhanced bilateral relations with existing pro-Palestinian outlooks on the continent, even if it seeks to take advantage of internal and external political and social economic dynamics to try and impact and lessen any pro-Palestinian sentiment. So the reasons for Israel's enhanced reach and influence in Latin America can broadly be ascribed to both Israeli foreign policy ventures over the past decade and socio-political changes within Latin America that occurred alongside developments in Latin America-US relations, and this is particularly true under the Trump administration. So from the Israeli side, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has been focused on deepening strategic relations with Latin America in a very similar vein as he has tried to do in other parts of the world. So under his leadership, Israel's foreign outreach to Latin America, similarly to successful diplomatic efforts across Africa, Asia, and the Arab Gulf, has been geared towards enhancing Israel's international stature and his own leadership credentials. So in 2009, when Netanyahu was re-elected, he appointed Avigdor Lieberman as his Minister of Foreign Affairs, who at the time was set the task of diversifying Israeli ties with Latin America alongside Africa. And in 2014, the Israeli government adopted a resolution to deepen its strategic relations with Latin American countries. And this included cooperation on anti-terrorism and security matters, economic cooperation, and enhancement of technological capabilities. And to further this increased cooperation, Netanyahu also engaged in what you might call symbolic diplomacy, through numerous visits to the region. So following an initial visit by Lieberman, Netanyahu became the first prime minister to visit South and Central America in 2017 to, in his words, and I'm quoting here, mark a new era in relations between Israel and Latin America, end quote. This initial visit was followed by several multi-country visits, including one to attend the ceremony, the inauguration ceremony of Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro in 2019. And in his push to strengthen renewed ties with Latin America over the past decade, Netanyahu has been able to leverage and has sought to leverage the ascendance of right-wing leaders and the increased influence of evangelical Christians. And this is particularly evident during the presidency of former Brazilian leader Jair Bolsonaro, who during the 2018 presidential election campaign declared that a period of rapprochement with Israel would begin. And with that, he also sought to reject the more pro-Palestinian and pro-Iranian stance of his predecessor, President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. So while Bolsonaro did not make good on his promise to move the embassy to Jerusalem, he did open up a commercial office in Jerusalem in an effort to play up his pro-Israel stance and to garner favor with evangelical supporters and, of course, US President Donald Trump. With that, I think it's still worth noting that similarly to the post-1948 period, Israeli-Latin American relations do not present what I would call a zero-sum game. And this has been acknowledged by Israeli officials. So in June 2023, Yonatan Peled, who's the Deputy Director General for Latin America and the Caribbean at Israel's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, declared, and I quote, "Israel's challenge today is to ensure, convince, persuade governments in Latin America that the relationship with Israel is not a zero-sum game. You can be pro-Palestinian, pro-Arab, that should not be a detriment to the relationship with Israel," end quote. Thus, Bolsonaro's public embrace of an overtly Israel shift belies both the bilateral relations that existed under his predecessor, Lula, and at the same time, the economic reality of Brazil's dependence on the Arab world. So in his quest to enhance relations with Israel, Bolsonaro was able to build upon economic ties that had already strengthened under Lula. And prior to his inauguration, Israeli exports to Brazil already exceeded 1 billion per year. At the same time, one of the reasons that Bolsonaro backtracked on the embassy move was due to the fact that he did not want to sever economic relations with the Arab League countries, which are among Brazil's largest commercial partners, including due to their purchase of Brazilian halal meat and other food products. And I believe that this duality will continue to affect Israeli and Latin American relations going forward. And it is therefore likely, in my opinion, that foreign policy rhetoric can and at times will be forced to diverge from domestic realities. With that, the immediate impact of the resurgence of the left wing in Latin America will probably focus on political, rhetorical support, including in international fora like the UN. To remain with Brazil, Lula's return has translated in the expected overtly critical stance towards Israel. In February, in a joint UN statement, together with the governments of Argentina, Chile, and Mexico, Brazil expressed their deep concern over the far-right Israeli government's decision to legalize new outposts and construct 10,000 homes and settlements in the occupied West Bank. And in another move to do away with his predecessor's influence, Lula's foreign ministry removed Ambassador Gerson Mendoza Garcia de Freitas from his duties in Tel Aviv in January of 2023, who under Bolsonaro was responsible for boosting bilateral relations. Yet Lula, similarly to his left-wing counterparts in Chile and Mexico, will need to balance this pro-Palestinian rhetoric with the deepened bilateral economic linkages that have been established in recent years with Israel, including by the signing of the Israel Southern Common Market Free Trade Agreement of 2007 and the acceptance of Israel in February 2014 as an observer state of the Pacific Alliance, which includes Mexico, Chile, Colombia, and Peru. As a result, going forward, I think Israeli-Latin American relations will offer another case study of the realpolitik that often drives countries' bilateral policy considerations and decisions. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions during the Q&A.
Thank you, Dr. Wermenbol. That's a quite wide-ranging and comprehensive review of how the relations between Israel and the region have evolved. I wanted to first encourage all participants to start sending their questions through the Q&A. But as I receive them, I'll start with a question for both of you. As we move towards a more multipolar geopolitical context where the dominance of the US is not as evident, how do you anticipate the relationship between Israel and Latin America to shift or change? So, Professor Kacowicz, if you can start.
Well, I like the question because I wanted to mention and continue the line of what Grace was referring to, that today, I think that we live in a very peculiar moment where we have a list. I think the economists came with a list of about 40 countries that they are quite relevant economies. And those 40 countries are called transactionalists. And what is interesting, that list includes the most important countries in Latin America, Brazil, Mexico, Argentina in that order, but it also includes some countries in the Middle East, like Iran, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Israel. So Israel, in a sense, in terms of its foreign policy, if Israel has a foreign policy, that's a different question, in a sense, does not want today to completely align with the United States, but rather positioning itself in the war between Russia and Ukraine, not taking a clear position, or trying to have very good relations with both the United States, that's a traditional special relationship, and China. So to your question, we are living in this moment where we see, in a sense, that the most significant Latin American countries and Israel are taking a similar position regarding this very turbulent world where we live. And that in itself is quite interesting because it's like the return of non-alignment, but in a different way, right? So Israel has decided not to take a clear position supporting Ukraine, unlike most of the Western countries. And Israel wants to have the relations with the US and China, not at the same level, but in this transactionalist approach, pragmatic or realpolitik, if you want. And in that sense, there is a commonality of positions between Israel and Latin America. And I think this is quite a new phenomenon, which is unrelated, of course, to the Arab-Israeli conflict or to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Grace?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's a great question. I think it's true that, as we see an increasingly multipolar world, that's characterized by global power competition and middle power brokers' desire to play off of that competition to a large extent. The dynamics of that will be interesting to watch. I do think that Israel, despite its stance in the war on the Russian war in Ukraine, will still continue to look to America as a preferred partner in terms of its foreign policy initiatives and as a preferred partner in its relationship going forward. But I do think the idea of middle powers and the playing off of not potentially superpowers, but of important powers against each other is relevant in the Latin American context. And you see that, for instance, with Brazil vis-a-vis Israel and Iran. So, and I think that that's true for other countries as well. So I think, the expectation was that with the return of Lula following Bolsonaro, there'd be an extreme shift to the left, and that would have huge implications, or will have huge implications for foreign policy dynamics vis-a-vis Israel and the deepening of relations that were established under Bolsonaro. I think that we'll have to kind of wait and see, because one of the things that, as I kind of explained in my opening remarks, is that duality in relations already existed during Lula's first term. So during Lula's first term, which was 2003 to 2011, sure, there was certainly Palestinian support. In 2008, Brazil recognized Palestine. There was also support for Iran. In 2009, Ahmadinejad visited Brazil. That led to a lot of international consternation. But at the same time, during Lula's first term, Shimon Peres visited Brazil, first time since 1966. And Lula visited Israel for the first time in 2010. Those important kind of some of the important free trade agreements that I mentioned, including Mercosur, where Israel became got observation status, were signed during Lula's first term. So going forward, well, I think it's clear, Iran and the Palestinian community has welcomed his return to power. His inauguration was attended by the Palestinian foreign minister, Maliki. I think, he will need to contend with the deepening of ties that have both happened under himself and his successor, Bolsonaro. The other thing that I think is worth mentioning, and this is true in Brazil and Colombia's case certainly, is that there have been defense relationships between these countries and Israel. In Brazil, during the 2000s, during Lula's first term, Israel signed various defense and arms agreements with Brazil. I also think it's important to realize that going forward, Brazil really relies on some of the fertilization techniques and other agricultural products for its own agricultural industry, particularly in the East, where it's a fruit producing nation. So I think these are, things to contend with going forward. So I think what you'll see is kind of a duality to these relationships where, yes, there might be engagement with Iran. Yes, there will be probably overt support for the Palestinian cause, but at the same time, relations with Israel will remain in place, particularly for those important industries and realms that Brazil will continue to depend on, even under a more left-wing leader.
Thank you. As a follow-up question, and Arie, you mentioned this briefly in your intervention, local Jewish and Arab Palestinian communities are not particularly large in numbers, but do they have an influence on the positions of governments in the region towards Israel? Do they have an impact on those positions? And part of that same question is, how much do Latin American voters, and given the increasing importance of the evangelical community, have an influence on official positions that Latin American governments take vis-a-vis Israel and the Palestinian issue?
Arie, you're in mute.
Muted.
Yes. I think those are two related but different questions. Regarding the impact of the Jewish communities in Latin America, I think the impact is very, very minor. I once wrote about those triangular relations that even I would make the argument that although there is an overlapping of interests, and Israel as the Jewish state is supposed to take care of the Jewish communities in Latin America, those interests, they are not always identical. And I think that the Jewish communities in Latin America, they don't have much of an impact upon the shaping of foreign policy. I think that here, and we should bring that to the conversation, there is the element which is still relevant of the US, or the importance of the Jewish community in this country, in the United States, right? As affecting their, you might say, weaker brothers and sisters in the region. As for the second point, and I think that Grace brought that, and I think that's very, very relevant, which is the rise and increasing importance of the evangelical movement in Latin America. We saw that in Brazil, we saw that in Central America, and they tend to support Israel, right? Notwithstanding what is the policy of any given government, and that might, yes, that might carry implications for the relations between Israel and Latin America, since the number of the evangelists in Latin America has been rising compared to the continent has been traditionally Catholic, right? And that's a point to take into consideration. I think has been taken by Netanyahu in choice of his policies, sometimes even at the expense of losing the support of the more liberal and progressive Jewish community in this country or in Latin America.
Grace, I don't know if you want to add anything on that topic.
No, I think Arie captured it well. I would just add that, I think we're clearly looking at Latin America through the lens of Israel right now, and I think that's important. I think, for instance, in Colombia, Duke, who was from Ivan Duque, who was from the Democratic Center, has recently come out and accused his successor, the left-wing leader, Gustavo Petro, of like further engagement with Iran. And, so I think, we're clearly looking at things through the lens of Israel, Iran, Palestine, but I think, the internal dynamics of this country, particularly in a place like Colombia, where the election was much more about inequality and the struggles that were going on domestically, I think those were extremely important. I don't think, Israel loomed large in that election. So while it might have consequences for the overt kind of expressions on Israeli foreign policy, I don't think that had a particular influence within that specific dynamic of that election internally. So I would just add that for contextualization.
Thank you. There's a question from the audience, and it's a question that was on my mind as well. How does the current political crisis in Israel and what is seen by many as a weakening of Israeli democracy going to impact Israel's foreign policy in general and in particular with the region? Arie, I don't know if you want to start us off.
Well, that's a very difficult question, and I would divide the answer in two parts. There is this general question regarding how this might affect the Israel foreign policy in general, right? Because the second part might be easier to try to assess, as Grace was saying. You have a continuity in the pragmatic or practical relations between Israel and Latin American countries, dealing with economic relations, with security, with cooperation, with technical issues, functional issues. I think that the more difficult question to tackle is how the domestic political crisis in Israel that, at least in my assessment as an Israeli citizen returning home in 2 weeks, I don't think we are talking about the judiciary reform, but and I don't want to draw far-fetched comparisons to Latin America, but I use the term and I explained that to my Israeli colleagues of autogolpe, right? This is an attempt by the government to change the regime, right? So that would probably affect and that would further jeopardize the image of Israel, whether Israel wants to see itself as still belonging to the family of liberal democracies, etc. And you could add to that, in addition to the domestic political crisis, of course, the attitudes and actions taken by this government regarding the Palestinian issue. And as it was mentioned in our conversation, that might further increase the animosity towards Israel regarding the positions it has been taken, right? So I would say, yes, this might carry negative implications in general, but at the same time, so there is a cognitive dissonance here, right? At the same time, it might not affect the inertia or the practical inertia of the continuity of relations, right? For instance, economic relations are not so important, but you see, as Grace was referring, an increase in the number of free trade agreements, in the volume of trade, right? $1 billion with Mexico, free with Brazil. It's still very small compared to other partners for Israel, but it's becoming more relevant. Cooperation in cybersecurity, in innovation, in technology, etc. My concern, I borrowed this, I think, from Aaron Miller, is that Israel, the image of the, you may say, the startup nation, in the last half year, we have turned into the mess up nation. And that might affect negatively the relations with Latin American nations or with any other countries around the world.
Grace?
Yeah, I'll just add a couple thoughts to that. I think that, for the left-wing regimes that are in place or have recently come in place or will come into place, I don't foresee that there will be an overt deepening or new establishment of relations with the current government in Israel. And I use overt intentionally because I think that, as Arie was saying, there will be a continuum of the relations that have previously been established. I don't think that we'll see a particular severing of ties as we saw in the late 2000s. Although I do think that what will be done, and this is part of what I discussed as part being the duality in relations, is that these left-wing governments will be using international fora and symbolic measures to criticize the current government in Israel. And we just saw an example of that in Chile with the president, Gabriel Boric, who refused to accept the credentials of the Israeli envoy to become an ambassador there. And that was very much in response to the events that were going on in Israel and the Palestinian territories and what he viewed to be the inordinate use of violence. So I think we're going to see an increasing kind of the symbolic criticism of Israel, usage of international fora to criticize, Israeli moves to the right, increased encroachment on Palestinian lands in the West Bank, and consternation over the amount of violence used in the West Bank, but then also potentially further consternation, and as has US President Biden has done, over what's going on and what that means in terms of the democratic nature of Israel within the 1948 borders. So I do foresee that going forward. With that being said, that comment both applies to Latin America and Latin America left-wing leaders, but it applies more generally across the world as well. As I just mentioned, US President Biden has been very overt in his criticism of Netanyahu and the desire for the judicial overhaul inside Israel. So I think we'll see that going forward. I also think that beyond Latin America, it's unlikely that we'll see a deepening or an overt establishment of ties as a result of this current crisis in Israel.
If I may add as a speaker, and this is, as I mentioned before we started, I read that in the news, you have a new president in Paraguay, Peña. I think that he was a host at the Americas Institute at Georgetown, right? And what I was reading is that the Israeli foreign minister is now visiting. He attended his inauguration in Paraguay. He would next visit Uruguay, and Paraguay would return the embassy that it had for a few months. It would return its embassy to Jerusalem, and Israel would return its embassy to Asunción. So Paraguay would be the third country in Latin America to have an embassy in Jerusalem, which is 3 countries out of 5, because otherwise you have the US and Kosovo, right? And it's not a counter argument, but you see, right, Peña taking that position, right? Which you might say it's quite extraordinary. I just want to reflect what Grace was mentioning before, the fact that although Bolsonaro promised in his campaign that he's going to move the embassy to Jerusalem, he didn't do that because Brazil has a stronger economic interest regarding Arab countries or Iran, right? But it's interesting because if we look in terms of patterns, you see this issue of the recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital, right, as one of the motives or one of the themes that have been with us since 1948 until today.
You both referenced the importance of Latin American countries in the initial partition vote at the UN. And Israel is continuously looking for peace with their neighbors with a new dynamic brought in by the Abraham Accords. Does a weakened position of Israel in the United Nations impact Israel's ability to go into negotiations with its neighbors? And will they perhaps try to reach out to Latin American countries to increase their relationships and their diplomatic ties in order to strengthen their position as they enter future negotiations? Grace, I don't know if you want to start with that.
Yeah, I think just quickly following on the last part of that question about using international fora, traditionally Israel has used international fora like UN, has used its kind of outreach to African countries and Latin American countries to bolster its own standing, and that's not necessarily been in furtherance of the Palestinian cause or Israeli-Palestinian peace for that matter. I'm somewhat pessimistic on a near-term return to negotiations between Israeli and Palestinians. I think that if you look at the domestic reality in Israel and for that matter, in the Palestinian territories, I think it's unlikely that the current climate is conducive to negotiations. And I say that for a few reasons beyond just the most right-wing governments being in existence in Israel at present. I say it also because if you look at the surveys that are currently being conducted within Israel and Palestine, there's very little appetite for a return to negotiations or a belief in any near-term resolution being possible. On the Palestinian side, I also think, since we've been dealing with a civil war since 2006, 2007, so it's very difficult to foresee a situation in which Israel would engage with one unified partner on the other side. And then in terms of the international dynamic, America has traditionally played an important role in negotiations. I don't think American foreign policy interests right now are focused on brokering an Israeli-Palestinian peace deal. I think they are elsewhere with the Ukraine war going on, with global GPC competition with China increasing. So I think the appetite from the international community is also not there at present. So I'm unfortunately slightly pessimistic on that account, at least for the near term.
Arie.
Well, I can only agree with what Grace said, and I think that unfortunately the UN is not very relevant here. I don't think Latin America is very relevant here. There may be a kind of competition when Israel tries to reach to Latin America, right? That it has been happening in the last decade, perhaps due to the increasing incursion of Iran in the region, right? That might be part of the equation. But the change regarding the future of the Israeli-Palestinian relations might be related to the change of leadership in both Israel and the Palestinian Authority. And I just want to add a short point, and Grace quote him, Jonathan Pellet. I attended his remarks at the Wilson Center in June, and I was surprised, and I approached him, I told him I was surprised when he was referring to the fact that from the Israeli standpoint, there is not a zero-sum approach, because that was not my sense. I mean, I was surprised by his position, and I don't know whether his position fits the position of the current Israeli government. I don't want to talk too much about that, because I think this is a very important point, and we are coming full circle. For the Latin Americans, that they fulfill a protagonist role in recognizing the right of the Jewish state, right, in the partition of Palestine. For them, it's not zero-sum. For them, supporting a Palestinian state makes a lot of sense. But from the Israeli perspective, that's not usually the way it's being regarded, especially not by this government. So I don't know what Latin America has to contribute. I remember that President Lula, in the previous Monday, he tried even to start a kind of mediation, right, between Israelis and Palestinians. One idea that I like to play is that maybe Israel should adopt what I would call the Latin Americanization of the conflict, which means Israel, once it might recognize a Palestinian state, then it might become a border dispute, like we have lots of them in Latin America. But that might be just my far-fetched dreams as an academic, right? So what I'm saying, Israel could learn from Latin America and the long experience that Latin America had to do with peace. But Latin Americans actively contributing to the management and resolution of the conflict, I don't see that happening.
Wonderful. I have a question on how Latin America has used its relationship with Israel to leverage or in its relationship with the United States. Has there been any triangular dynamics between these three regions that you could speak about or elaborate? Grace, perhaps you want to start.
Yeah, I think that's certainly the case. I think, it goes both ways. It's both U.S. trying to project its influence to the South, which I discussed vis-a-vis, the 1947 partition vote, but it's also the desire to influence America's impact to the South through outreach to Israel. That was certainly the case, I think, more under President Trump, more so than it is under President Biden, from what I understand. So as you saw, like following the US decision to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, you saw an increased movement on Latin American countries' behalf to also at least state that they would move their embassies to Jerusalem. Now, as Arie said, that hasn't always happened. In the case of Bolsonaro, it didn't happen for a variety of reasons. But the symbolic nature of that statement was certainly meant to curb kind of Washington's interest in Latin America itself, be it through aid or bilateral relations deepening. So that's certainly the case. I think that was more so under President Trump when there was a combination of leaders who had similar worldviews, similar political leanings. I think it's less so now under Biden, but I think traditionally that has been the case in the past.
Again, I agree, Grace, and I would say that there has been a pattern here, a historical pattern where the Gentile world, meaning in many countries around the world, maybe this might be another version of the protocols of the Elders of Zion, right? Or if you look at the Israeli lobby, but by my colleagues Mearsheimer and Walt, you have this argument that Jews have they rule the U.S. or Israel has a very special relationship with the United States. So in a sense, the road to Washington, you can get to Washington when you have good relations with Jerusalem. So I think whether this is a myth or whether this is real, I don't know, but I think this is part of the equation. And you see that, I guess, for instance, I can see that when you look at several Central American countries, look at the two countries that they have their embassies in Jerusalem, right? When you think Guatemala and Honduras. So their special relationship with Israel is reflected also in their need to cater to the United States, right? So I think it is there, right? When Carlos Menem, as the late former president of Argentina, he allowed that they were born in Argentina, like me, that you could travel to Argentina with your Israeli passport. This was part of the very close relations he wanted to develop with the United States, right? So what I'm saying, and this is part of the equation, and this has been a motive and a theme that you have to consider when we try to understand the complexities of the Israeli-Latin American relations, indeed.
If I can just add one thing, I also think you sometimes see the reverse. So sometimes an overt desire not to cater to the US. And this is particularly true, for instance, with Brazil. And you saw this under Lula's first term, where there was this desire also to use international fora to kind of question, criticize the US hegemony, and also like gain recognition for Brazil's role as an emerging power. And that's where I also think, again, to go back to this kind of constant thread that I think we've been developing during this talk, is this duality, where again, Lula is now, engaging, willing to engage with Iran, allowing, a warship to come to dock in the ports. And I think there's there's also the reverse, where it's an overt desire not to kind of focus on what U.S. interests are, but to kind of use that international fora and overt kind of symbolism to practice and posture independence and power within your own right. So I'll just add that as a follow-on thought there.
It's like the two sides of the coin are bringing the darker side, Grace, and you're right. I mentioned before that Israel played quite a sinister role of a proxy, right, during the Central American wars. Or remember Colombia before the current regime, it was considered like the Israel in Latin America due to the special relations that they have the two countries and their close relations with the United States. There are always two sides to the coin, and you brought the other one, you're right.
Wonderful. Well, we're almost at a time, so I want to close with some remarks. Thank you for joining us. I know you both have very busy schedules, and Arie, you took off time from your vacation to join us, so I thank you for that. But it seems that this duality that has characterized the relationship between Israel and Latin America, where it seems leaders have been very pragmatic, the rhetoric goes one way, and then economic and military cooperation goes the other way, might not last as governments both in Israel and the region become a bit more polarized and radicalized. Who knows, maybe Arie hinted at that in his remarks, that this might not be tolerated by the current Israeli government. So, but we'll see. We're happy that you both joined us. It's an issue, as I mentioned earlier, that it's not very given much attention. And I think as the Institute, it's important to talk about issues that sometimes perhaps are overlooked in DC and in the region. I want to encourage everyone to follow us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, visit our webpage and continue participating in our events. We will start having more in-person events when the semester term starts. Students will be starting classes on August 23rd. So please join us. And again, thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. Thank you, Arie. Thank you, Grace.
Thank you very much.